Hi, perhaps you recognize me. It's your favorite president.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
I mean,
I know you want to ban our national flags, but we're going to wave you goodbye.
What does confrontational mean? It means you'll fight for what you believe.
Enough was enough! And I said, let Trumpomania run wild, brother!
It is not merely our privilege to be strong, it is our duty to be strong.
G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Commanding the Narrative. My name is Stephen Tripp. Thank you to everyone who is watching this podcast. If you are watching live, you can contribute to the chat today. The link is also the link to StreamYard is also in the chat if you want to call in. So please jump on those opportunities. We'd love an interactive episode and a discussion. So if you want to contribute, please do so. Big news today. I normally kick off with Buy Me a Coffee. Now, a lot of people have been saying to me, I'm not completely happy with Buy Me a Coffee. They, for whatever reason, don't trust it. So we've got some new options now. So the best way, if you want to support us, is by heading to commandingthenarrative.com and hit the donation button. And there's new options there for you to donate. Just like this week, Jason Strecker did. Now, I've had Jason on the show previously. He's made a very, very generous donation. I was blown away by the donation that Jason and his family made to me this week. I always say it gives me a warm and fuzzy feeling inside. You wouldn't believe the warm and fuzzy feeling I had this time. But Jason and his family are good people. They're wonderful people, and I really don't deserve their support. But it helps to pay for the stream, and also helps to pay for the website as well. So if you do want to contribute as well, head to commandingthenarrative.com and hit that donate button. Also, head to commandingthenarrative.com, as you should always do as well, to sign up to the weekly newsletter. We do a lot of podcasts through the week, also articles and events as well. So hit the sign up button in the top right hand corner, and you can keep up to date with everything that we're doing. It's the best way. Please don't rely on social media. Also, if you want to get your hands on some unfiltered, uncensored truth, head to thelightaustralia.com. If you want to contribute, you can become a distributor. Hit the distribute button there and sign up. Or if you're in Sydney and close to the Northern Beaches, you can call the number 0406 861 816. And there's been a pallet already paid for, and you can distribute it to people across Sydney. Lastly, I just want to give a big shout out to Joel Jamal and the ARC podcast. I was helping out Joel behind the scenes yesterday when he had a whole bunch of gentlemen on speaking about Bitcoin, gold and silver, and also property. If you're interested in investing, or maybe where the investment market is going here in Australia and also globally, check out this podcast. It was really, really good. So it's the ARC podcast, episode 23. I really recommend that one. But let's kick it off today. I want to bring in first Mr. Kevin Loughrey. Now, Kevin's been on the show a number of times. You should know him by now, former Lieutenant Colonel in the Australian military. Kevin, welcome back.
Oh, hello, Stephen. Thanks for having me here.
No, it's always my pleasure to have you on. Now, you've facilitated this interview today with Professor Will Happer, so thank you very much for doing that. You're also gearing up for the election coming up. Now, you don't exactly know where you're going to fall, whether you're going to be running lower house or upper house. We can reveal that in the coming weeks, hopefully. But you're looking for speaking engagements as well, right?
Absolutely. As many as I can get.
Yeah. So you recently spoke here in Sydney at a number of different events. But if you're anywhere in New South Wales and you would like Kevin to speak, how can people contact you, Kevin?
They can either go to my website and I'll find my contact details there. They can ring me. My telephone number is 0416 276 624. That's 0416 276 624. My email is kevinl@kevinloughrey.com.au.
Excellent. Please support Kevin because he's a good man and he's working very hard behind the scenes. But as I said, you've organized this interview today. I'm very grateful that you've done so, and I'm humbled to have this guest on. His name is Professor Will Happer. He's a physics professor from Princeton University in the United States of America. He's worked as on a number of presidential administrations advising government, and he's also recently featured in Climate the Movie, which was all about pushing back against the climate narrative that is prevailing across the world. Let's introduce him now. Professor Will Happer, welcome to Commanding the Narrative.
Hello.
We're very pleased to have you. Kevin, I might hand it over to you to kick things off because you were the man behind organizing this interview. So you get the first question to Professor Happer.
Oh, wow. Yeah, look, Professor Happer, I'd be very interested in knowing the backstory to Climate the Movie. Who approached you, or did you initiate it, or who initiated it? All that sort of thing. You played a major role in that, and I really enjoyed the movie. We've actually shown it about 3 times here within what is you could call the Richmond electorate. And we particularly show it in the area of Byron Bay, where we have a lot of green-leaning people. We're trying our hardest to educate them and just basically say, look, the situation's far more complex than is painted, and there really isn't anything to worry about. But over to you. What's the backstory? How did you get involved in Climate the Movie?
Well, I actually had nothing to do with making the movie. I was privileged to be asked to say a few words on it. And the people who produced it, Tom Nelson in particular, was a friend of mine. So I think it was simply chance personal connections. I've always spoken out about what I think is a lot of stupidity about climate. So people knew what my views were to begin with.
Has there been much blowback, or what's been the response?
Well, most people have not seen it in America. You know, it's too bad because it is a very good movie, I think.
Oh, it is that.
Yeah.
I can say that having watched it numerous times. In fact, I have to say that after about 3 times, I get rather impatient sitting in the audience waiting for everybody to watch what I've already seen many times. But yeah. I'm really struck by your forthrightness. You know, you don't hang back. You say something along the lines of, it's a hoax or a scam, and I don't really like the word hoax or scam. I can't remember what it is, but you were unequivocal, and I thought, my godfather, that's really good. I totally agree with your sentiments, by the way.
Well, I prefer scam because hoax implies, a little bit of humor, not much ill intent, whereas scam, you're really taking advantage of people. So that's more what climate nonsense is. It's more like a scam than hoax.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with the scam. I say that all the time. But one of the things that we hear from the other side is that the science is settled. The science is settled. We don't need to question it anymore when it comes to climate change. What are your feelings when you hear people say that the science is settled?
Well, people who say that really don't know how science works. Science is never settled. I mean, to be a scientist, you the first thing you have to do is to question the existing science. And, when science is settled, that means that it's no longer science, but politics has taken over. A good example of settled science was biology in the Soviet Union under Stalin and Khrushchev. It was completely controlled then by this charlatan Lysenko. And if you questioned Lysenko's dogma, for example, by talking about genes or talking about hybrid crops, you were lucky if you only got fired, and most people were sent to concentration camps and 1 or 2 were sentenced to death. So that's when science is settled. Science is settled by politicians.
We haven't yet reached that stage, though. Here in Queensland, if doctors, I should say here, I'm on the Queensland border or close to the Queensland border, but north of where I live, if doctors prescribed hydroxychloroquine and other medicines for the early treatment of COVID-19, they were threatened with a $50,000 fine and 6 months in jail. I think that's getting very close to what you were talking about with the Soviet science.
Yeah, it is very close. And in some perverse way, I'm grateful to the COVID epidemic because it's opened the eyes of lots of people who, were much too trusting before. They believed everything that they read and what they thought were trusted media. And after seeing what happened with COVID, they're beginning to wonder, I can see in COVID that, I was lied to. Maybe that's not the only issue I'm being lied to about.
Do you see a coincidence of actors in that regard?
Some of the same people are involved. Emergencies have throughout human history been used to amass power. That's the way you get power from people, is you persuade them that only you can save them from this existential threat. It's been one crazy threat after another, most of them imaginary, but it works very well. For Hitler, it was the Bolsheviks, for the Bolsheviks, it was Hitler. You can go back through history and find lots of examples of this. And so today we have climate, or we have epidemics, but it's the same playbook that works so well.
One of the things that the other side rely on is modeling when it comes to climate change. They're always putting out a new model, a new computer model about where the world is headed, and they make these big predictions that never seem to happen. Can we rely on modeling?
No, of course not, especially for climate, because, it's an unbelievably complicated system. You've got, 2 major fluid bodies, the atmosphere and the ocean, and fluids are absolutely notorious for being hard to predict. There's a joke that they tell in my community in physics about Werner Heisenberg, who invented, quantum mechanics, matrix mechanics and quantum mechanics. And he headed the German atomic bomb program during World War II, and he was a terrible leader, so we were lucky that they chose him. But one result was, after World War II, they forbade him to work on nuclear physics and high energy physics and things he was really interested in, because they thought it might somehow help a new bomb program and some new German dictator. And so instead, he was forced to work on fluid mechanics, so that's the physics of the atmosphere, that's the physics of oceans. And he was just horrified by how hard it was. Here's a guy who invented quantum mechanics, and he discovered he couldn't do fluid mechanics. It was too hard. And so one of his students said, well, Professor Heisenberg, when they say that after you die and you go to heaven, if you've been a good person, the Almighty will answer 2 questions for you. And what will you ask the Almighty when you have this chance? And Heisenberg thought for a little bit, and he said, well, I'm going to ask him 2 things. And one is, why relativity? And the second is, why turbulence? And he said, and I think the good Lord will be able to answer the first one, right? And so the implication was that, you know, fluid mechanics is even too hard for God. It's a joke.
There's a similar one relating to a genie in a bottle, and the guy wants to build a bridge from somewhere to somewhere across an impossibly large thing, and the genie says, "Can you think of anything else?" And he said, "Well, could you help me understand women?" And the genie says, "How long do you want that bridge?"
It's that kind of joke, yeah.
Yeah, it's similar. So I think it's there's a name for this. But anyway, look, coming back to, I noticed also we had Tony Heller on your Climate the Movie. Did you get a chance to meet with Tony, or do you know Tony very well?
I do know Tony, and I have a tremendous respect for Tony. You know, he's been very brave to tell the truth and to dig into the facts about climate history, fairly recent history within the last 100 years.
Yes.
And what you discover when you look at the history is it has nothing to do with what's being claimed in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And, you know, and that takes some effort. You know, it's not that easy to dig out the information. And he's gone to the trouble to get information directly from federal agencies and has pointed out how, you know, doctored so much of the data is. You know, you look at the temperature history of the United States as recorded in, say, 1980, it looks completely different today, you know, and usually it's the future that you're uncertain about, but in this country now, it's not clear what the past is. The past keeps changing.
Well, it's a good segue because I've got a clip from Climate the Movie that I'll play now related to what, you know, climate over time. So let's listen in.
With milder weather, humans began to emerge from their caves, and 1,000 years ago, we see the rise of the first great civilizations in a blissful period which, according to many studies, was considerably warmer than today. This is known as the Holocene climate optimum.
It was called an optimum because people thought that warmer was better.
Since then, temperatures have declined and begun to fluctuate. In Roman times, there was a blissfully warm period, followed by a brutal cold period in the Dark Ages. Then came the balmy medieval warm period, according to many studies, as warm or warmer than today, followed by an especially cold period known as the Little Ice Age, possibly the coldest in the last 10,000 years. And here it is, the Roman warm period, the cold Dark Age, the medieval warm period, and then the very cold Little Ice Age, from which, for the past 300 years or so, we've been recovering.
Now, the part about this movie that I really love is that it takes a lot of the information that people like Kevin, people like myself, people like you, Professor Happer, we already know this, but it puts it in such a presentable type of way. Instead of looking at boring graphs, it's made it, it's making it digestible for the general public out there. And it's talking about the different cycles in temperature that we've had over time.
Yeah.
Why did the other side ignore this when they just focus on maybe the last 100 years or so? Why can't we look at temperature over the ages?
Well, the other side, there are some honest people on the other side, but not many. And so most of them are very worried about the next year's funding for their research or next year's funding for their tax advantages or this or that. And if there's no climate crisis to combat, then why pour all this money into fighting something that doesn't exist? So it's, there's this old saying, I guess it was Upton Sinclair, who, a socialist who ran for governor in California in the 30s and lost. And he made this comment, well, it's very hard to explain something to a man whose salary depends on not understanding it. So I think that's the answer to your question.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, if we can just dwell for a second on the matter of the temperatures, you and I have exchanged emails, and I've shown you that from Tony Heller's data, all the land-based data shows that there's been a gradual decline since about 1880 to the present day. And many say, no, there's been a rise, and whether there's a rise or a decline, it really is not that important in terms of whether CO2 affects the Earth's atmosphere or whatever. But if there has been a fall whilst there's been CO2 rising, then it puts paid to the whole question of CO2 and other greenhouse gases appreciably affecting the Earth's atmospheric temperature. And just without talking too long, you would be aware of the ice cores, which is actually dealt with in the movie, and the fact that over the last 8,000 years, the temperatures have been dropping, whereas the ice core from Antarctica shows that carbon dioxide has actually been increasing over the same period that the temperature was dropping. But latterly, I'd just like to now bring the focus to the last 140 years. And all of the data which Tony has assembled, everywhere around the world, shows a gradual decline, except if you are near urbanization, and that was covered in the movie. And even, for example, the longest one, which is in England, has been, I suspect, affected by urbanization, in that it's not out in an area that's never been encroached upon by humans. And so I'm interested in knowing whether you've got any sort of theories as to why the satellites are showing a warming over the last, from 1979, I think it is, to the present day, which I suppose is a short period climate-wise. 30 years makes a climate, I believe. But yeah, I'd be very interested to hear your point of view on that subject. And I'm open to any suggestions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, the satellite record is obtained by looking at microwave emission coming up from the atmosphere. And by looking at different frequencies, it's around 60 gigahertz for the techies in the audience.
Yeah.
You can look at different layers in the atmosphere. And if you analyze that data, it does show a very slow warming since 1979, you mentioned. And
right, yes.
one thing that gives you some confidence in that is that that satellite record agrees very well with the radiosondes from balloons. You know, we launch thousands of balloons every day around the world to get weather data. And one of the important things they send down is temperature. And that balloon temperature record is almost the same as the satellite record. So both of them agree that the atmosphere is warming. Now, the satellite doesn't do a real good job with the surface. So, you know, the reason for that we don't need to go into right now, but it does quite well once you get a few kilometers above the surface. I think there's been warming since about 1800. One of the pieces of evidence for that is from Glacier Bay in the United States. I don't know if you've been to Alaska, but if you get a chance, you should visit Glacier Bay.
Right.
It was first charted by the British explorer Vancouver, for whom, you know, many things are named, but he charted Glacier Bay in about 1790 and showed that it was full of ice right out to the Pacific Ocean. And by 1850, more than half of it had melted, and this was long before there was any increase in CO2.
Yeah.
So whether that's really a thermometer, it's certainly true that the ice disappeared, and that you can track that from the moraines, you know, the sediment in the bottom of the bay. And by 1870, it was almost all gone. It was so striking that John Muir, who was the founder of the Sierra Club, made a special trip to Alaska and wrote a book about what he observed about the disappearance of this glacier in Glacier Bay. It's called Travels in Alaska. It's worth reading even today. You can download it from the internet. And one of the things he did was he talked to the local Native Americans, to the Indians there. And they said, oh, yes, that glacier has only been there for 100 years. You know, our great-grandfathers remember when it advanced, and it covered up our hunting grounds. You know, it was really terrific hunting there until it got covered up by the glacier. And it's done that 2 or 3 times in our oral tradition. And John Muir was quite dubious about that, but geological studies show the Indians were absolutely right. And in fact, there's an interesting lawsuit. It may be settled by now, but it wasn't when I was at Glacier Bay, between the Indians and the federal government about who owns this newly freed land that used to be covered with ice. And the Indians say it's our ancestral hunting ground. And the government says, no, it's all been bared by, you know, global warming. So, of course, the Indians are correct. You know, it's quite clear from the evidence there. You can find tree stumps and things. So they're absolutely right. It has nothing to do with man-induced global warming. But I think there's been some very mild warming. It's very similar to the warming that led to the settlement of Greenland by the Norse, you know, around the year 1900. And it was much warmer then than now. I was a kid in Scotland. My father was Scottish, and I used to go walking in the hills south of Edinburgh, the Pentland Hills there. There may be some listeners who are familiar with them, but if you go up those hills now, they're very cold. You can't farm them. It's too cold even today. But you can see the ruins of farms that flourished in the year 1000 at the same time that the Norse were, you know, in Greenland. So it's clear that the earth, and you see the same thing in the southern hemisphere. You see traces of this in New Zealand too. So it was a worldwide phenomenon. So there are these natural cycles of warming and cooling, which are really interesting, very important to mankind. And understanding that's probably been set back by 50 years by this manic focus on CO2, right? So we've done a lot of damage to real climate science by the demonization of carbon dioxide.
Have you seen a demonstration where they get 15 billiard balls on different lengths of string, pull the billiard balls up to an apex and then let it go, and a pattern forms? And the patterns are quite various because each swing is asynchronous, e.g. that it's not in any way related to the other ball. And I believe that there are about 15 celestial cycles that they've identified as having an influence on the Earth's climate. You've obviously got the Milankovitch cycles, which were codified around the end of the First World War. But I was fortunate enough to sit through a lecture by Professor Arthur Vitorito. Have you had any dealings with Arthur?
No.
Arthur's been studying submarine volcanoes for at least the last 25 years. And evidently, when we had there's another fantastic fact which many of the listeners may not know, but the Earth's surface is covered by about 71% water, and the average depth is about 4 kilometers. When you think of that, that's staggering, the amount of water that's covering the Earth. And this has an extreme inertia, thermal inertia. It holds a heck of a lot more energy than the air ever possibly could. And where Arthur was coming from is that a large amount of that water was actually once sitting above the land, above the sea, on the land. It was lifted up by the sun and then deposited as ice onto the land. And as that's melted, the Earth's crust has changed shape. As it is, the Earth is an oblate spheroid. But when you take the load off, it comes out even more, and that causes cracking at the top and the bottom of the Earth's crust, which then gives rise to increased volcanism. And if you have these, and he's been studying these volcanoes on the western circumference of Antarctica, and part of his you could call it his intuition, not totally proven, but you can be sure that there's an awful lot of energy being given off into the seawater, and that there are currents which flow by Antarctica and in fact influence the warmth of the water even up around Norway, such as the interconnection between all of these all of these currents. And one has to wonder whether it's possible that the temperature of the ocean is affected by this. You mentioned, for example, that the ocean temperature has been steadily rising, and according to Professor Vitorito, so have the number of volcanoes. And that then, in fact, I won't go to the next bit yet, but I'd be very interested to hear what you think about that general subject.
Well, this is something I'm not an expert on, but on average, if we look across the Earth, the heat coming out of the interior is about a part per thousand of that coming in from the sun. That's average. Of course, there's a lot more when a volcano erupts, but that's a small fraction of the surface.
Right.
So
about 1,000th, you said.
Yeah.
Right.
1,000th. It's measured in milliwatts per square meter as opposed to watts per square meter.
Yeah, right.
The unit's 1,000 times different. So West Antarctica, I think, is quite well known. It's underlain by quite active volcanoes. And so that's one of the things that contributes to the instability of the ice sheet there. Again, I think it's one of the things that it would have been more profitable to study some of that than all of these absurd computer models on the effect of CO2 on the atmosphere, which they don't mean anything. They'll give whatever answer your sponsor would like. And
I like that. Your sponsor would like. Yes.
Well, the other people that like this stuff are politicians, and they've jumped on this climate alarmism. And here in Australia, we have a group of them called the teals, which are basically independents that are funded very heavily by the renewable sector. They've gone into conservative seats and presented themselves as conservatives that are worried about climate change, and they're really preventing our conservative government from getting into power, because there's 6 or 7 of them that have popped up. One of them is called Allegra Spender. She's the member for Wentworth, which is in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. I've got a clip from her that I just want to play now, and then I want to ask you a question from what she has to say.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. 2023 was the hottest year on record, and these records are already being broken in the first few months of 2024. The climate crisis is accelerating, and the world's top climate scientists recently told us they expect global temperatures to blast past 2.5 degrees, causing catastrophic damage to our planet. To avert the worst impacts of climate crisis, we have to get off fossil fuels. We have to stop opening new coal and gas projects, and we need to move as quickly as possible to renewables. And yet, despite...
So that's what she had to say. Now, she used the wording, we're set to blast past 2.5 degrees in warming. So my question for you is, if it's possible for the Earth to have a climate catastrophe due to warming, in your opinion, how much warming would have to take place for that climate emergency to happen?
Well, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old by many geological estimates, and it's warmed and cooled by many degrees in the past. And I don't think it's ever been too warm for life. If you look at the geological record, most of the time when it's warmer, there is more life. Life likes warmth. And the problems have been, cold. There's some evidence for a snowball Earth when, most life disappeared. It'd be a shame to go back to that.
Yes.
Even Australia was covered with ice at that time. Of course, at that time, Australia was stuck to South America and to Antarctica. But look, it's very hard for Earth to warm much because we're sitting here glowing in the dark into space. We're a glowing ember in very, very cold space. And, the rate of emission of energy from the Earth is a very strong function of temperature. It's approximately it's the fourth power of the temperature. That's a huge factor. There are not many things in nature that go as the fourth power. That means, for example, if you were to double the temperature, you would increase the power to space by 16 times, two to the fourth, right? So even tiny amounts of warming are completely enough to cope with a little bit of greenhouse gas or some other small effect. So it's quite difficult to either increase or decrease the temperature of Earth very much because of this fourth power. Most people, are scientifically illiterate, like this poor woman.
There's a difference between a lie and an untruth in that when one is lying, one knowingly is telling an untruth, but that woman's too stupid to know whether she's telling an untruth. And what she did say was just totally untrue. I was gripping my fists as I'm listening to this drivel coming from this woman, and to think she sits in Parliament, and that she's not alone. That to me, the greater majority of people who are in Parliament, you wouldn't employ in your business by any stretch, and they have an enormous amount of power over everybody, and they're just basically wrecking this country. So I had the great thank you. I'm going to need counselling after that, Stephen. Thank you very much for that.
Well, there's a saying that the best manipulators are the ones that have already been manipulated, and I feel like this could be the case with Miss Spender. But if the world was to blast past 2.5 degrees in warming, Professor Happer, would you be concerned?
Well, I don't even know what 2.5 degrees means. Does that mean averaged over the surface, or if you look at how the Earth warms, typically it doesn't warm much near the equator, and so most of the warming is near the poles. So, in warm periods, for example, when they had hippopotamuses swimming up the Rhine River and even in the Thames, the equator was about the same temperature as it is today. So if there were warming, if it goes like the historical record, it would mean that northern and southern parts of the globe would be warmer, but not much would change, at more tropical latitudes. To my mind, that would probably be good. It would open up more land for cultivation. It would give more opportunity for life. And so but 2.5 degrees, it doesn't compute, as they say. If you look at what you would have to do for that to happen, it just can't be done.
Well, add to that it's not true. What she said was that it was the hottest years on record or some such rubbish. And the data does not support that. I've seen, in fact, in Germany, they called it the Bodentemperatur. And what they actually did was put the thermometers on the ground to get the excessive temperature. It was a fraud. Whereas I think it has to be normally a Stevenson screen is at something like approximately 2 meters above the ground, and preferably with about 100 meters away from any sort of structure.
That's right.
And they don't actually conform to that.
Well, you're right. I mean, just measuring temperature, especially when the sun is shining, is very difficult. If you get a little sun glint, that completely distorts the temperature measurement. That's why you need the shades and the Stevenson screens and stuff like that. It's a lot easier at night when the sun isn't shining.
Here in Australia, we swapped out analog measuring equipment for digital measuring equipment, and there were good reasons for doing that. It gave us possibly better accuracy, but it also meant that it costs less because we didn't have to send somebody to go and physically read the thermometers and such. But when they did so, they put the digital equipment into a smaller box. And as you would know, the box gets warm and the box radiates internally. And so that radiation, which is related to the square of the distance, it becomes sizable. And the temperature which your equipment will reach is equal to, or is caused by, or related to, or affected by the amount of energy entering it to the amount of energy that is escaping it, and it reaches steady state. So our BOM, I don't think deliberately, I think it was incompetence, put this stuff into a smaller box, and then they denied that they'd actually run the two systems in parallel for any period of time. It turns out that they did, but they wouldn't reveal it. And when you do look at the two systems running in parallel, you see that the digital equipment records a much larger, quantitatively speaking, or relatively speaking, a much larger temperature than does the analog. But then, to add insult to injury, someone nobbled the double EEPROM inside the circuitry such that it would not record temperatures lower than minus 10 degrees centigrade, which of course then has a profound effect on anything relating to average temperatures. They've also put recording systems near urban conurbation. The one in Sydney is classic. It's right in the middle of suburbia. And so it's really useless for the purposes of determining trends. The ones which would be most useful are the ones which are out in rural areas that have never ever been encroached upon. And I hate to sound like a stuck record, but all of those show that the temperature's been dropping from 1880 to the present day. But that's not to say that it's not been different elsewhere, and we've just dealt with ocean currents before. I had the pleasure of being with the British Army for 4 years, and I spent 2 years in the southwest of England, and we did, of course, as Australians do, a lot of touring. And there are places along the Irish and Welsh coasts that are almost tropical, and they're affected by the ocean currents flowing by. So, and I mentioned, I bring you back to the billiard balls. There are so many influences here. It is extremely difficult for anybody to make any sort of prediction as to what's going to happen into the future, I'd suggest. And from all the data I've seen, it is, I have to say, it is a scam. This is being driven by avarice, by financial institutions. But interestingly also, I'd like to point out to the listeners that this benefits most of all the Chinese Communist Party, in that every industrial power that has embraced this nonsense is going backwards in their economics and their ability to be industrialized. The Communist Chinese came to an agreement that they would not reduce emissions until after 2050, but they have as their stated aim to be the supreme power of the world by 2049. So any promise made after that date, I'd suggest, is not one should rely upon. COVID also helped the Communist Chinese. It got rid of Trump, and they also put Tedros in power. They put out an awful lot of phony videos to cause panic. They basically prohibited the use of mRNA vaccines on mainland China, instead using a protein-based vaccine, which was ineffective and known to be ineffective. They stopped all domestic travel, but they allowed international travel, knowing that it would travel all around the world. When you add up all of the things that the Communist Chinese did, I can only come to the conclusion that this was a plan that had been in gestation for many years, and they carried it out. And they basically used also the greed and the avarice of the Western organizations like Vanguard, BlackRock. We have a corrupt medical fraternity, which I hope Trump will sort out over at the CDC and FDA. And we definitely have a corrupt medical fraternity here in the TGA. I'm very heavily involved in this also, Professor. I'm intimately involved in trying to defend doctors who were deregistered or suspended from practice for having spoken out about this, not unlike what you were talking about in the Soviet Union again. So I see this all as part of a very sinister trend, which we could end up with the Chinese Communist Party running the world. And if they ever get to that stage, as I've often said to Stephen, they'll line up all the rich people and they'll shoot them, because their money is simply a number on a digital database. And it means nothing. If they disappear and their bank accounts disappear, the ledger's drawn and we start all over again. So if any of those wealthy chaps are listening, be aware that your lives are likely to be quite short after 2049.
Are we getting towards a question?
I'm sorry, you're right. Look, moving on to the grand solar minimum, which we've had Professor Valentina Zarkova speaking to us, and in your film you had the effect that cosmic rays have on cloudiness. I think Professor John Clauser mentioned that. You may have also talked about it. But according to Professor Zarkova, we're actually well into a grand solar minimum, which will reach its nadir on 2035 or thereabouts. Have you given any thought about it?
Well, this idea goes back to one of the attempted explanations for the Little Ice Age, when it really was very cold. And that was also a solar minimum. There was 100 years where no one saw any sunspots, and it wasn't for lack of looking. They had telescopes to see them, and they saw them before and they saw them afterwards. So many people have speculated that there was a cause and effect, that the lack of sunspots meant that there was a lot less solar magnetic fields to shield the Earth from cosmic rays. So cosmic ray intensity was higher for 100 years, and that produces more clouds. And so it was a more cloudy Earth for a century, and the clouds reflect the sun, so it got colder. So it's a simple idea.
Yeah.
And so the idea is maybe that's going to happen again. I believe, maybe, I'm sure I'm oversimplifying it, but I think that's roughly what Zarkova is talking about. And nobody knows. Whoever said prediction is hard, especially of the future, was right. And but we'll see. There are certainly good reasons to suspect that the sun has been largely responsible for past changes in climate. For example, if you look at radioactive isotopes produced by the sun, carbon-14, for example, it does correlate, the production rate correlates with temperature. That's quite clear from the geological evidence. And some of the others, there's a beryllium isotope that also correlates on a much longer time scale. So there are legitimate reasons to suspect that the sun is the major driver. Well, it's the main source.
Yeah, that's Willie Soon says that. Yeah, and I agree. Yeah, unequivocally, I agree. Yeah.
Now,
we've got, just of interest, we've been having really spectacular southern lights, and that might just simply be solar flare activity or whatever, but we had solar lights like you would not. I live at a place called Keith Hall, and if you go around about 70 to 80 kilometres south of here, it might be a little more, might be 100, there's a place called McLean, and only a few weeks ago, there were the most spectacular southern lights over McLean. That's never happened in my knowledge. People talk because of Facebook.
What latitude south is that?
Oh, now I couldn't tell you. I'm south of the equator, obviously, and we must probably be down close to that middle line between the equator and the North Pole, the South Pole. So, Steve may be able to help us out here. He's look for Grafton, McLean. What latitude?
Every 20 years, we see northern lights here in Princeton.
Right.
But we're 40 degrees north. And
okay.
So it's quite rare, at least where we are, to see them. And I would guess that where you are was even further, even closer to the equator than we are. We're 40 degrees from the equator. That was probably less than 40 degrees. But I'm not an expert on Australian geography, so I'll have to go look at my globe when this interview is over.
Steve,
it says Ballina is 28 degrees.
And what would Grafton be? And McLean. You see Grafton, and you can see where McLean is. There's McLean,
Yeah.
Grafton, I think, is 178 kilometers from here.
Well, that's really spectacular because that's extremely close to the equator compared to
It is, isn't it?
you normally see northern lights from my my side of the globe.
Yeah. Yeah. And that I was just sort of thinking that obviously they're cosmic rays which cause that, or charged particles anyway. They could be solar flares from, solar particles coming in from the sun. But if this grand solar minimum works the way it's supposed to, we should end up with a lot more northern and southern lights, because there'll be more cosmic rays entering our solar system.
Yeah, and with respect to clouds, what we should end up with is more clouds.
Yes, and therefore a cold. And that actually is the amplifying effect, isn't it? You've got the sun waning in its natural 11-year cycles.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got the effect that clouds have in reflecting radiation from the Earth. So it's a double whammy.
That's right.
I want to get back to the climate the movie and play one more clip from that. I do encourage everyone to go and watch it. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube or type it in to one of your search engines and it should come up. It's a fantastic documentary and I highly recommend it. This is the last clip that I want to play from it, and then I want to get your thoughts.
CO2 is plant food, and the result of much higher levels of atmospheric CO2 in the past was a much, much greener world.
Periods of elevated CO2 tend to be time periods of a huge biodiversity on the planet. In fact, we're in a CO2 famine if we look over the last 550 million years.
At the depths of the most recent glacial maximum, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere sank so low, all life on Earth came close to extinction.
They say CO2 is higher than it's been for 100,000 years. But what they don't tell you in that period they're talking about is that CO2 sank so low that all life on Earth nearly died.
20,000 years ago, CO2 is at the lowest level it has ever been in the history of the Earth, 180 parts per million. If it had gone down another 30 parts per million, we'd all be dead.
There is a low point of CO2 where photosynthesis becomes so inefficient that plant life would die. Then everything else starts to perish after that.
During the last glacial maximum, there's good evidence that in many parts of the world there was plant starvation from not enough CO2. So we should be very grateful that CO2 levels are beginning to go back up. We're still far from the historical norms, which would be several thousand parts per million. There's not enough fossil fuel to get there, but at least we're making a start.
So I mean, that completely flies in the face of the narrative that we hear about the climate alarmism side of things. But in regards to CO2, carbon dioxide, if we were to increase it in the atmosphere, what would the benefits be?
Well, we can already see benefits from the modest increase we've had from about 280 to, I don't know, 425, 430 today. One of the benefits is that desert edges are shrinking because the main benefit of CO2 is it allows plants to live in regions that don't get enough rainfall normally. And that's fairly easy to understand. You know, a plant, it breathes CO2 through holes in its leaves. And it has to have these holes to let CO2 molecules diffuse in so the plant can use sunlight as the energy source to put together the CO2 and the water to make sugar. That's how it works. But the problem the plant has is for every CO2 molecule that diffuses in through this hole, there's 100 water molecules diffusing out the other way. So plants squander water like you wouldn't believe in trying to make sugar. And they have to, there's no way around it. And so one huge benefit of CO2 is if you have twice as much CO2, you only have to have half as many holes in your leaf. And so you only leave you only lose half the water that you did, when there was less CO2. And so we're seeing that very clearly all around the world is the arid parts of the world are greening. and the parts that are green are greener than they used to be because they're less susceptible to drought than they used to be. So there's just no question that more CO2 is good for plant life, for photosynthetic life. I'm, of course, talking about land plants. You know, the Earth is 70% ocean, but we get most of our food from the land. And their CO2 is hugely beneficial to plant life.
I'm very conscious of the time, but I want to squeeze in a couple more questions. Now, you worked for the first Donald Trump administration, and you actually sat down and met with him. What were your impressions of Donald Trump?
Well, I think his instincts are very good. You know, we talked about trying to set up a scientific review of climate, and he was enthusiastic. He thought it was a good idea. He wanted to participate, actually. He wanted to have a fireside chat with the American people to explain that this is really a religion. It's not normal science. And but his advisors thought this was a terrible idea, like the young woman who spoke that you displayed a little bit before. People like that would be offended and they would vote against Trump. That was the argument. And so in the end, they prevailed, my opponents prevailed, and we never did the review. But now I'm hoping that since he presumably won't run a second campaign, that he will have such a review. We call it a red team, blue team review. It's something we do all the time for things like weapon systems. You know, we never build a new fighter aircraft or a new gun without lots and lots of critical review. And these are not, you know, softball reviews. You know, they're quite serious, and you get the most aggressive people you can find, you know, to poke at these and try and find something wrong with them. And that's how you get a good system. Climate has never had to do that. You know, it's been completely protected, so it's never had to defend itself against competent science reviews. It'd be a much stronger area of science. It's not even a science area in my view right now, but it could become that if it would subject itself to the normal, you know, give and take of science.
Yeah, and you also knew his uncle John Trump, who was a professor at MIT. Do you have any memories of John Trump?
Well, I never met John, but I knew of his work, and I used some of his work. John was a student of Van de Graaff, so he was involved in making Van de Graaff generators. There's one, yeah. And he made some very major improvements. He was a very smart guy. And he apparently did have some influence on President Trump. President Trump remembered him during the you know, visiting during Thanksgiving and talking about physics. And so that was a lucky break for me that he had a soft spot in his heart for physicists, for his uncle.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Kevin, before I finish with my question, do you have a final question or comment for Professor Happer?
Oh, just of interest, I actually travelled to Canberra at my own expense to meet with the Deputy Prime Minister, Michael McCormack, and I showed him those graphs, which I've shown you. And he said, oh, this is the first time I've ever seen this. In the background, I'd been communicating with Tony Heller, and I asked Tony if he would be prepared to come to Australia to be part of a black and white team, the de Bono black and white hat approach, or red and blue team. And I really hope that President Trump uses Tony Heller. I hope and also yourself, and Professor Coonan and Clauser and so forth. I mean, we've got an A team that we could put in, and I don't know which one you call it, the blue or the red. I suspect the blue is the ones that believe in the cold, and the red belongs to the hot. I don't know who takes what side. They're opposite views, and I hope they recruit you for that purpose. It would be fantastic. And by the way, you would change the world, because definitely the FDA, and I hate to drop back to COVID again, but they are very, very closely related. The CDC, FDA had a profound effect on the direction that Australia took. And if we could get the United States government to debunk this dreadful thing called climate change, then it would be just manna from heaven. You would save this country, because we are in really deep trouble right this moment. We're $1.3 trillion in debt with nothing to show for it. And they're spending something like $350 billion, which is eye-watering to a country of our size, putting in renewables, which are actually, they're not renewables, they're unreliable, so I wash my mouth out, but they're bringing in unreliables and they're completely destroying our electricity grid. There is absolutely no way that these things can deliver abundant, cheap, reliable electricity. And we have a CSIRO that's so thoroughly incompetent and corrupted. They've come out with a thing called GenCost, and if you ever, well, no, you have too many other valuable things to do, but I've actually read it, and if that was a student of mine at university, I would fail them or suggest they go back and do the year before again. It is just shocking. It's a really shocking piece of work. So, look, thank you very much for coming here. I'm really honoured to see you again. I hope one day I get over to Princeton. You never know, your luck in a big city. I might also get elected to Parliament if I got really lucky. So if that's the case, my door would always be open. I can assure you I'd make a big fuss of you if you come to Australia. And if you see Tony Heller or you happen to run into him anywhere, give him my best regards, will you? I have enormous admiration for what he has done. Fellow engineer, brilliant man, and a truth teller. So good luck to him.
Well, good luck on your election, and good luck to Australia. I hope they get you.
Thank you very much,
Have
Professor.
you ever been to Australia, Professor Happer?
Oh, yeah.
What is that?
Have you been to Australia?
I have, yes, several times. It's a great place.
Excellent.
A lot of it better weather than Princeton.
being ruined by idiots, I'm afraid. We've got to. I'll share with you some of my writings one time about how we could improve both the government, the way we vote, and our government. And in fact, some of these things are applicable to America too, that has its issues and its problems.
Well,
but having looked at all the different systems, sorry.
These do these things from time to time. For example, we did it in America with prohibition, which we've still not fully recovered from. That's where all the organized crime families got started.
Right.
But it was much like climate. You couldn't stop it. There were people like the young woman, talking about the poor widows and orphans who were going to die if we didn't vote for prohibition, and so we did, and it was a disastrous experiment. It's the only constitutional amendment that's ever been repealed. And so we will eventually get out of this one too. The only question is how much damage is done before we do.
Yeah, that's the big question. All right, I have to ask this because this is so much of my childhood. When I was growing up, there was this big focus on the ozone layer. So I noticed when I had a quick look at your Wikipedia page, and you can't always take Wikipedia for gospel, but it says that you were not only were you the director of the Department of Energy's Office of Science as part of the George H.W. Bush administration, but you also in the Department of Energy for the Clinton administration, and you're removed from that or dismissed in 1993 after disagreements on the ozone hole. Now, when I was growing up, this was the big thing, the ozone layer, and it's depleting, and we need to get rid of CFCs and all this sort of stuff. And then nothing ever happened about it. I don't know if they fixed the ozone layer. I don't know if it's still there. I don't know I haven't heard anything since. What's your
still
view?
there, just as big as it was as when I was director of energy research. Nothing has changed really. And we banned these refrigerants were banned by the Montreal Protocol in the early 90s, but the ozone hole is still there, just as big as ever.
So that we can add that to it.
It's probably always been there. They don't have good measurements before the satellite era, but there's some indirect evidence that it was there in the 20s and 30s.
Okay, so we can add that to the list of scams and hoaxes that we've had to deal with over the years.
Yeah, looks like it.
Oh dear, oh dear. Oh look, I really appreciate you coming on today. It's late in New Jersey. I'm sure Kevin also appreciates you coming on. If anyone wants to follow some of your work and your writings, they can head to CO2Coalition.org. And you'll be able to keep up to date with Professor Happer there. You also still out there interviewing and going on different platforms. So look, we need more people like you in the world that are willing to speak out and just try and get the truth out there, try and get your knowledge out there, and it's really important. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks,
Yeah,
Jeff.
thank you.
Both of you would be welcome to come to Princeton. We'll get our photo in front of Einstein's house.
Oh, yes. Let's book the flights, Kevin.
I'm there. Yeah, that'll be fabulous. And thank you very much once again. Profound thanks.
Okay.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
definitely. Now,
Cheers, mate.
thank you also to the audience for watching. As I say every single time, please share this out. It's very important that this information gets out there, particularly, I think, for the youth, because there's so many young people that are worried about this stuff, just like I was worried about the ozone layer when I was young, and nothing ever happened with that. So please share this if you do have young kids or teenagers or even young adults that are completely swept up in this climate alarmism. Send them this interview with Professor Happer. Send them the movie as well, because that's an excellent way of getting real information to these people. So thank you very much for everyone who's watched today, and we'll see you all next time.